So it is my honor now to introduce Dr. Stef Craps, whose research focuses on the ways in which post-colonial literature in English attempts to bear witness to the suffering produced by colonial oppression. Stef Craps explores the ethico-political risks involved in the memory work that trauma theory undertakes. Stef Craps' work has been instrumental in rethinking contemporary trauma studies in order to include marginalized experiences of trauma that cannot always be understood within the confines of Western modernity. Stef Craps is an associate professor of English literature at Ghent University, Belgium, where he directs the Cultural Memory Studies Initiative. He is the author of Post-Colonial Witnessing, Trauma Out of Bounds, and Trauma and Ethics in the novels of Graham Swift, No Shortcuts to Salvation. He has guest edited special issues of Criticism, a quarterly for literature and the arts and studies in the novel on topics of transcultural negotiations of Holocaust memory and post-colonial trauma novels. His next book projects are an introductory guide to the concept of trauma for Routledge's new Critical Idiom series with Lucy Bond, as well as an edited collection titled Memory Unbound, tracing the dynamics of memory studies with Lucy Bond and Peter Vermeulen. Please join me in welcoming Stef Craps.
Good afternoon, all. I'd like to start by thanking Sarah for that generous introduction, and I would also like to thank Chandrima for inviting me to participate in this exciting and important conference. It really is an honor to be here. As a commemorative event, this conference effectively counteracts the many acts of erasure, cultural, political, institutional, and even literal, evidence in the history of the Air India disaster. And I want to commend Chandrima, Jesse, Sarah, and the other organizers for all their efforts in putting it together, making it happen, because it seems to me that in so doing, they are performing a significant public service for the local community, for Canada, and beyond. There is something at stake here, which can't be said of all academic conferences, but then this is so much more than an academic conference. I must confess up front that I am not an expert on the Air India bombing, which is why I feel very humbled and a little nervous, frankly, to stand before you today. However, much of the research that I've done over the last 10 to 15 years has dealt with trauma and memory in post-colonial settings, and hence resonates with some of the issues raised by the historical tragedy around which this conference revolves. And I hope that what I have to say will prove somewhat relevant to you. My talk consists of two parts. In the first part, I'm basically going to lay out part of the theoretical argument that I develop in my book, Post-Colonial Witnessing, Trauma Out of Bounds. What is the argument about? It concerns an area of cultural inquiry that has attracted a great deal of attention over the last 2 decades and which goes by the name of trauma studies or trauma theory. In a nutshell, I argue that trauma theory needs to be globalized more thoroughly and more responsibly. I contend that trauma theory in its classical mid-1990s formulation is marked by a Eurocentric monocultural bias which sits uneasily with the field's commitment to the promotion of cross-cultural solidarity. I will try to demonstrate this bias in 3 specific areas under the rubrics of focus, definition, and inscription, argue the need to correct it, and offer some suggestions as to how this can be done. In the second part of my talk, I will very briefly analyze 3 literary texts against this theoretical background: a poem, a novel, and a short story by 3 different women writers with hyphenated identities. The 3 texts are an excerpt from Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American Lyric, Aminata Fauna's The Memory of Love, and Bharati Mukherjee's The Management of Grief. And the last of these was actually written in response to the Air India tragedy, as I assume many of you know. Before launching into my critique of trauma theory, I should probably say a few words about what it is exactly. Trauma theory is an area of cultural investigation that emerged in the early to mid-1990s as a product of the so-called ethical turn affecting the humanities. It promised to infuse the study of literary and cultural texts with new relevance. Amid accusations that literary scholarship, particularly in its deconstructive, post-structuralist or textualist guise, had become indifferent or oblivious to what goes on in the real world, the world outside the text, trauma theory confidently announced itself as an essential apparatus for understanding the real world and even as a potential means for changing it for the better. This epistemological and ethical program is clearly laid out in the highly influential work of Cathy Carruth, who is one of the founding figures of trauma theory, along with Shoshana Fellman, Dory Laub, Jeffrey Hartman, and Dominic Le Capra. In Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative and History, 1996, Carruth argues that a textualist approach, one which insists that all reference is indirect, need not lead us away from history and into political and ethical paralysis. Quite the contrary, she claims, it can afford us unique access to history. Carruth conceives history as being inherently traumatic and trauma as an overwhelming experience that resists integration and expression. Conjoining a psychoanalytic view of trauma with a deconstructive vigilance regarding the indeterminacies of representation in the analysis of texts that bear witness to traumatic histories can grant us paradoxical mode of access to extreme events and experiences that defy understanding and representation. Moreover, this critical practice comes invested with ethical significance. Carruth claims that the specific mode of reading or of listening that trauma demands can help break the isolation imposed on both individuals and cultures by traumatic experience. In a catastrophic age such as ours, Carruth writes, trauma itself may provide the very link between cultures. With trauma forming a bridge between disparate historical experiences, so the argument goes, listening to the trauma of another can contribute to cross-cultural solidarity and to the creation of new forms of community. Remarkably, however, the founding texts of the field, including Carruth's own work, largely fail to live up to this promise of cross-cultural ethical engagement. They fail on at least 3 counts. They marginalize or ignore traumatic experiences of members of non-Western or minority groups. They tend to take for granted the universal validity of definitions of trauma and recovery that have developed out of the history of Western modernity, and they often favor or even prescribe a modernist aesthetic of fragmentation and aporia as uniquely suited to the task of bearing witness to trauma. As a result of all of this, rather than promoting cross-cultural solidarity, trauma theory risks assisting in the perpetuation of the very beliefs, practices, and structures that maintain existing injustices and inequalities. And I will address each of the 3 aforementioned points in turn. So first, the marginalization of non-Western and minority traumas, then the supposed universal validity of Western definitions of trauma, and finally the problem of normative trauma aesthetics. Despite the omnipresence of violence and suffering in the world, to which the artwork by Thomas Hirschhorn that you saw on the first slide strikingly bears witness, most attention within trauma theory has been devoted to events that took place in Europe or the United States, most prominently the Holocaust and more recently 9/11. As is apparent from the work of Carruth, Fellman and Laub, Hartman and Le Capra, trauma theory as a field of cultural scholarship developed out of an engagement with Holocaust testimony, literature and history. However, if trauma theory is to redeem its promise of cross-cultural ethical engagement, the sufferings of those belonging to non-Western or minority groups must be given due recognition. As Susanna Radstone observes in an article on the limitations and exclusions of trauma theory, it is the sufferings of those categorized in the West as other that tend not to be addressed via trauma theory, which becomes in this regard a theory that supports politicized constructions of those with whom identifications via traumatic sufferings can be forged and those from whom such identifications are withheld. Judith Butler spells out the far-reaching consequences of such constructions in her book Frames of War, When is Life Grievable?, where she argues that, quote, the differential distribution of precarity is at once a material and perceptual issue, since those whose lives are not regarded as potentially grievable and hence valuable are made to bear the burden of starvation, underemployment, legal disenfranchisement, and differential exposure to violence and death. A one-sided focus on trauma suffered by members of dominant groups could thus have pernicious effects at odds with trauma theory's self-proclaimed ethical aspirations. In an anthropological study of trauma, which is titled The Empire of Trauma, an inquiry into the condition of victimhood, Didier Fassin and Richard Rechtman confirmed the existence of tragic disparities in the use of the concept of trauma despite its alleged universality, disparities which they explain as follows. Recognition of trauma, and hence the differentiation between victims, is largely determined by two elements: the extent to which politicians, aid workers, and mental health specialists are able to identify with the victims in counterpoint to the distance engendered by the otherness of the victims. Cultural, social, and perhaps even ontological proximity matter, as does the a priori evaluation of the validity of the cause, misfortune, or suffering, a valuation that obviously implies a political and often an ethical judgment. Thus, trauma, often unbeknownst to those who promote it, reinvents good and bad victims, or at least a ranking of legitimacy among victims. The Air India bombing strikes me as a case in point at both the collective and the individual level. It was initially constructed, as we've already heard during the previous session, as a non-Canadian tragedy involving non-Canadians, despite the fact that the vast majority of the victims, as well as the suspects, were Canadian citizens of Indian origin. The victims, their families, and the suspects were discursively distanced from the Canadian nation. It is only relatively recently that the Air India disaster has been reframed as an act of terrorism that directly affected Canada, and that the victims and their families have come to be embraced as Canadians. Well, nowadays, the Air India disaster is sometimes referred to as Canada's 9/11. That description distorts the history of the Air India case. As journalists John Geddes and Ken McQueen note, the date of the attack is not seared into the nation's soul. For a long time, the Air India bombing was not recognized as a national trauma. Consequently, the victims' family members did not receive the level of psychological and other support that the state could otherwise have been expected to provide. Identification with them as fellow Canadians was withheld. The source of their suffering was misidentified as a foreign problem, none of Canada's business. But to come back to trauma theory, breaking with Eurocentrism requires a commitment to broadening the field's usual focus to encompass the traumas of non-Western and minority populations. These traumas must, moreover, be acknowledged on their own terms. This, it seems to me, is another area where trauma theory has tended to fall short, which brings me to the definitional issues that I wanted to discuss next. Today, the concept of trauma is widely used to describe responses to extreme events across space and time, as well as to guide their treatment. However, as Alan Young reminds us in The Harmony of Illusions, Inventing Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, it is actually a Western artifact invented in the late 19th century. The origins of this historical product can be located in a variety of medical and psychological discourses dealing with Euro-American experiences of industrialization, gender relations, and modern warfare. As Laura Brown has observed, hegemonic definitions of trauma have been constructed from the experiences of dominant groups in the West, that is, quote, white, young, able-bodied, educated, middle-class Christian men. And as a result, trauma has come to be understood as, quote, that which disrupts these particular human lives, but no other. This historical and geographical situatedness means that there is nothing self-evident about the notion that Western definitions of trauma can be unproblematically exported to other contexts. It can even be argued that the uncritical cross-cultural application of psychological concepts developed in the West amounts to a form of cultural imperialism. And this claim has been made most forcefully by Derek Summerfield, a psychiatrist who sharply criticizes humanitarian interventions to provide psychological assistance in international conflict situations. Psychiatric universalism, Summerfield writes, risks being imperialistic, reminding us of the colonial era when what was presented to indigenous peoples was that there were different types of knowledge and theirs was second-rate. In the assumption that Western-style trauma programs are necessary to avoid a post-war crop of psychiatric disorders, which is used as a basis for interventions in the lives of war-torn populations around the world, Summerfield hears, quote, a modern echo of the age of empire when Christian missionaries set sail to cool the savagery of primitive peoples and gather their souls which would otherwise be lost. These and similar accusations are reiterated by Ethan Waters in his book Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche from 2010. Waters critiques what he calls the grand project of Americanizing the world's understanding of the human mind. Over the past 3 decades, he writes, Americans have exported their ideas about mental health and illness around the world without regard for cultural differences, imposing their definitions and treatments as the international standards. One of the 4 case studies Waters examines is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The others are anorexia, schizophrenia, and depression. He reports on the Western trauma counselors who arrived in Sri Lanka following the 2004 tsunami. In their rush to help the victims, Waters claims they inadvertently trampled local expressions of grief and practices of healing, thereby actually causing the community more distress. I think this critique is also relevant to the treatment of the victims' relatives in the aftermath of the Air India bombing. And I'll come back to that in my discussion of Mukherjee's short story. Both Summerfield and Waters reject the widely held belief that PTSD constitutes a timeless, acultural, psychobiological phenomenon. They argue instead that the PTSD construct reflects a Eurocentric monocultural orientation. Much criticism has in fact been leveled at the dominant formulation of PTSD in the American Psychiatric Association's Authoritative Diagnostic Manual, or DSM, for its perceived failures of inclusiveness. Particularly contentious is the definition of what constitutes a traumatic stressor, that which causes trauma. This is typically thought of as a sudden, unexpected, catastrophic event. Indeed, since the beginning of his discussion, trauma has been associated with an image of a single devastating blow or an acute stab that breaks the protective shield of the psyche. Many feminist and multicultural clinicians and researchers have argued that this criterion is too narrow because it makes some important sources of trauma invisible and unknowable. In particular, the punctual or event-based model of trauma tends to ignore the normative quotidian aspects of trauma in the lives of many oppressed and disempowered people. The chronic psychic suffering produced by the structural violence of racial, gender, sexual, class, and other injustices. This model can thus lead psychotherapists to an inability to grasp how these people's distress is in fact post-traumatic. The narrow range of possible traumas in people's lives implied by the traumatic stressor criterion in its current formulation needs to be expanded, it is argued, as there are many other experiences than sudden, unexpected, catastrophic events that can result in post-traumatic symptoms. Concrete suggestions that have been offered for extending current definitions of trauma include type 2 traumas, complex PTSD, or disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified, safe world violations, insidious trauma, oppression-based trauma, post-colonial syndrome, post-colonial traumatic stress disorder, and post-traumatic slavery syndrome. These attempts to go beyond or diversify the DSM definition of trauma can assist in understanding the impact of everyday racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, ableism, and other forms of structural oppression. Even though post-traumatic symptoms may be exhibited, the chronic psychic suffering caused by such experiences does not qualify for the PTSD diagnosis if, as is often the case, an overt threat or act of violence is absent. Dominant conceptions of trauma have also been criticized for considering trauma as an individual phenomenon and distracting attention from the wider social situation. And this can be particularly problematic in a cross-cultural context. After all, in collectivist societies, individualistic approaches may be at odds with the local culture. Moreover, by narrowly focusing on the level of the individual psyche, one tends to leave unquestioned the conditions that enable the traumatic abuse, such as racism, economic domination, or political oppression. Problems that are essentially political, economic, or social are medicalized, and the people affected by them are pathologized as victims without agency. They are seen as sufferers from an illness that can be cured through psychological counseling. The hegemonic trauma discourse would thus seem to negate the need for taking collective action towards systemic change. To that extent, it works to depoliticize issues of social injustice. Rather than helping the cause of the socially disempowered, it actually obstructs it. The concerns about the PTSD construct expressed by mental health professionals and the alternative paradigms which they have proposed have received very little attention from within the field of cultural trauma research. The impact of different cultural traditions on the way trauma is experienced and on the process of healing is rarely acknowledged. Moreover, trauma theory continues to adhere, for the most part, to the traditional event-based model of trauma, according to which trauma results from a single extraordinary catastrophic event. It follows that the traumatic impact of racism and other forms of ongoing oppression cannot be adequately addressed within the conceptual frameworks which trauma theory provides. I've argued that trauma theory needs to become more inclusive and culturally sensitive by acknowledging the sufferings of non-Western or minority groups more fully and on their own terms. I will now address the textual inscription of such experiences and suggest that certain received ideas and assumptions about how literature bears witness to trauma may need to be revised. More specifically, I will challenge the notion that traumatic experiences can only be adequately represented through the use of experimental modernist textual strategies. This notion, which can be traced back to Theodor Adorno's notorious pronouncements about poetry after Auschwitz, has become all but axiomatic within trauma theory. Trauma theorists often justify their focus on anti-narrative, fragmented, modernist forms by pointing to similarities with the psychic experience of trauma. An experience that exceeds the possibility of narrative knowledge, so the logic goes, will best be represented by a failure of narrative. Hence, what is called for is the disruption of conventional modes of representation, such as can be found in modernist art. However, this assumption could lead to the establishment of a narrow trauma canon consisting of nonlinear modernist texts by mostly Western writers, modernism being a European cultural tradition. Think of W.G. Sebald, Paul Celan, Charlotte Delbos, or Jonathan Safran Foer, for example. To quote the introduction to Jill Bennett and Roseanne Kennedy's collection, World Memory, Personal Trajectories in Global Time, there is a danger that the field is becoming limited to a selection of texts that represent a relatively narrow range of traumatic events, histories, and cultural forms, rather than engaging the global scope of traumatic events and the myriad forms that bear witness to them. In his book, The Trauma Question, Roger Luckhurst similarly laments trauma theory's sole focus on anti-narrative texts and points out that the crisis of representation caused by trauma generates narrative possibility just as much as narrative impossibility. Beyond the narrow canon of highbrow avant-garde texts, he reminds us, a wide diversity of high, middle, and low cultural forms have provided a repertoire of compelling ways to articulate that apparently paradoxical thing, the trauma narrative. In his book, Luckhurst explores this broad range of testimonial forms, studying popular trauma memoirs and novels, Stephen King, for example, alongside more canonical trauma texts. Following in Luckhurst's footsteps, Anne Roth has published a study of popular trauma culture, which looks at misery memoirs as well as daytime TV talk shows like Oprah and Jerry Springer. Roth reiterates Luckhurst's point that, quote, narratives of victimization and survival, trauma and recovery are anything but restricted to scholarship in postmodern trauma theory and the select examples from the literary and filmic canon that constitute its limited empirical corpus. She goes on to argue that it is precisely the question that trauma studies scholarship has left out that ought to be explored, namely how the ubiquitous notion of trauma functions in contemporary culture. I support these calls for trauma theory to expand its realm of analysis beyond a select group of modernist and postmodern works to encompass a much broader range of trauma narratives. It is indeed time trauma theory faced up to and fixed its aesthetic elitism problem. An additional reason why the field's attachment to a modernist aesthetic is problematic is the shakiness of the underlying assumption that there is a necessary relation between aesthetic form and ethical effectiveness, regardless of context. After all, narrative devices and representational strategies that may once have been experimental and unconventional inevitably become familiar and recognizable conventions with time and through overuse, ossifying into genre cliches. As Alan Gibbs argues in Contemporary American Trauma Narratives, 2014, the supposedly challenging disruptions to ordered narrative prescribed by the dominant trauma aesthetic have become hackneyed, and consequently their effect has been blunted. In fact, he attributes the persistence of what he identifies as the trauma genre, conventionally unconventional trauma writing, in part to a limiting inward-looking tendency whereby literature and criticism exist in a mutually reinforcing circuit. Trauma writers borrow from trauma theory to lend their works credibility, while trauma theorists, in turn, see their positions validated in the convenient mirror of this theory-based literature. Gibbs describes an echo chamber effect, which further entrenches hegemonic assumptions regarding the representation of trauma and its impact. He calls for greater attention to texts that challenge the accepted formulas, such as realist trauma novels, or what he calls traumatic metafiction, texts that either ignore or actively undermine the supposedly unconventional conventions of orthodox trauma writing, and which as a result may actually be more successful in conveying the experience of trauma and affecting readers. In fact, even before the trauma genre arguably lost its effectiveness due to overfamiliarity, it placed certain limits on how trauma literature worth its salt was allowed to affect readers, limits which in practice excluded engaged literature bearing witness to ongoing injustices from the trauma canon. Orthodox trauma writing tends to position witnesses as passive, inarticulate victims, testifying indirectly by converting their suffering into broken, traumatized speech to a truth of which, by definition, they cannot be fully conscious. This mode of address makes it impossible for their testimony to act as a political intervention. Indeed, all it can do is invite the reader to show empathy and vicariously experience the victim's trauma. There is no place then in the trauma canon for literature driven by a burning political need in which the narrator speaks as an expert about his or her own experience, makes political claims, denounces injustice, and educates, shames, or mobilizes the reader. Literature, that is, that more often than not relies on a no-frills realist aesthetic, as the overriding concern is to get the message across and to get the reader to take action rather than merely to empathize. I am insufficiently familiar with the literary and cultural response to the Air India bombing to comment with any authority on how it fits into this picture, but I think it is fair to say that Air India literature has, for the most part, not found its way into the trauma canon, which of course partly explains my lack of familiarity with it. I wonder to what extent this non-canonicity is due to the reasons I just mentioned, and I look forward to finding out more about this and many other matters later today and tomorrow. What I've tried to do in this lecture so far is to expose some of the limitations and blind spots which I think trauma theory will need to confront if it is to stay relevant in the globalized world of the 21st century. In the second and final part of my talk, I will illustrate this argument with 3 very short case studies of contemporary literary texts which seem to me to call for a more inclusive, pluralistic and politicized form of trauma theory. All 3 texts are written by diasporic women writers and deal with issues of trauma in cross-cultural contexts. The first text I want to look at is a brief poem by the Jamaican-American poet Claudia Rankine. It's from Citizen, an American lyric collection published in 2014 that examines the experience of racism in the United States and the West, more generally, through vignettes of everyday discrimination and prejudice, and meditations on the violence, whether linguistic or physical, that has impacted the lives of numerous racially marked subjects. The poem in question captures and denounces the mental health profession's traditional blindness to the psychic suffering of people of color. Let me read it for you. The new therapist specializes in trauma counseling. You have only ever spoken on the phone. Her house has a side gate that leads to a back entrance she uses for patients. You walk down a path bordered on both sides with deer grass and rosemary to the gate, which turns out to be locked. At the front door, the bell is a small round disc that you press firmly. When the door finally opens, the woman standing there yells at the top of her lungs, "Get away from my house! What are you doing in my yard?" It's as if a wounded Doberman Pinscher or a German Shepherd has gained the power of speech. And though you back up a few steps, you manage to tell her you have an appointment. "You have an appointment?" she spits back. Then she pauses. Everything pauses. "Oh," she says, followed by, "Oh yes, that's right. I am sorry. I am so sorry. So sorry." The poem recounts the first encounter between a trauma therapist and a patient addressed in the second person, who unexpectedly turns up on her front doorstep after finding the side gate locked that leads to the back entrance, which the therapist normally uses for patients. Having only spoken with him on the phone before, the therapist evidently assumed her new patient to be white, but he turns out to be black. In fact, she does not immediately recognize him as her patient, but sees him as an intruder and trespasser and reacts in anger and fear, yelling at him to leave the premises. It is not until the unwelcome guest manages to tell her that they actually have an appointment that it dawns on her that this is in fact her new patient. And on realizing her mistake, she apologizes profusely. This anecdote reads like an allegory of the insensitivity to racial and cultural difference characteristic of traditional trauma theory, an attitude that, it is implied, generates further trauma. After all, the black man on the receiving end of the trauma counselor's rage is made to suffer a microaggression in being verbally assaulted and treated like scum. And such experiences can foster traumatic responses as they accrue over time. The prevalence of insidious trauma in the lives of people of color is also a central theme in The Memory of Love, a novel by the British Sierra Leonean writer Aminata Forna, which was published in 2010. The Memory of Love is set in the capital of Sierra Leone in 2001, in the aftermath of a gruesome civil war. Instead of focusing on the war itself, the novel examines how those who survived the war cope with the physical and psychological scars of those years. Of particular interest for my purposes is the role played by one of the novel's 3 protagonists, Adrian Lockhart, a British psychologist specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder, who is volunteering with the Stretched Mental Health Services in Freetown. Adrian functions as a conduit through which we learn the stories of the Sierra Leonean characters. Like the primarily Western readership of The Memory of Love, for whom he acts as a point of identification, he's an outsider who does not fully understand the situation in which he finds himself and who moves from bewilderment to insight in the course of the narrative. Adrian brings familiar Western ideas to the problems of the local population that he has been parachuted in to help solve. However, this strategy proves unsuccessful. The novel makes it quite clear that Adrian's approach is inadequate to the situation he is confronted with. The novel's critique of the application of Western therapeutic models in the Sierra Leonean context crystallizes in a dialogue between Adrian and Attila, one of the few local psychiatrists to remain in the country. As head of the city's mental hospital, Attila has allowed Adrian to also treat some patients there, but Attila has always kept his distance from Adrian. However, when Attila at one point takes Adrian to see a cramped, stinking shantytown built on a sewage dump on the outskirts of Freetown, the following conversation unfolds between them. It begins with Attila saying, "A few years back, a medical team came here. They were here to survey the population. Do you know what they concluded? They were here for 6 weeks. They sent me a copy of the paper. The conclusion they reached was that 99% of the population was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder." He laughs cheerlessly. Post-traumatic stress disorder. What do you think of that? Adrian, who is entirely unsure of what is expected of him, answers, "The figure seems high, but strikes me as entirely possible from everything I've heard." When I ask you what you expect to achieve for these men, you say you want to return them to normality. So then I must ask you, whose normality? Yours? Mine? So they can put on a suit and sit in an air-conditioned office? You think that will ever happen? No, says Adrian, feeling under attack. But therapy can help them cope with their experiences of war. This is their reality. And who is going to come and give the people who live here therapy to cope with this? Asks Attila and waves a hand at the view. You quote a disorder, my friend. We call it life. He shifts the car into first gear and begins to move forward. And do you know what these visitors recommended at the end of their paper? Another $150,000 to engage in even more research. He utters the same bitter chuckle. What you need to know that you cannot tell just by looking, eh? But you know, these hotels are really quite expensive. Western rates, television, minibars. He looks across at Adrian. Anyway, he continues, you carry on with your work. Just remember what it is you are returning them to. Several criticisms and accusations come together in this excerpt that resonate throughout the novel. Attila's key objection is that the assumption underlying Western notions of trauma recovery, that the patient is to be returned to a state of normality through psychotherapy, ignores the reality of life in Sierra Leone, one of the poorest countries in the world. Living conditions there are still very hard now that the war has ended. For most people in the world, in fact, pain is life. The normal experience is one of oppression, starvation, or deprivation and upheaval. Freedom, affluence, and stability, the Western standard of normality, are actually the exception rather than the rule. You call it a disorder, we call it life. What for privileged Westerners is only a momentary deviation from the normal course of their safe, valued, and protected lives is a constant reality for most Sierra Leoneans who lead poor, vulnerable, and unprotected lives. What we have here then is an instantiation of the critique of the event-based model of trauma and the associated methods of treatment, which risk obscuring the chronic suffering and structural violence experienced by the Sierra Leonean population and indeed by much of the world. An exclusive focus on psychotherapy is a misguided response to the psychic suffering of the Sierra Leonean population. It is suggested in that the normality to which people will be returned after therapy is one of enduring pain, whose root causes, which are socio-economic and political in nature, remain hidden and go unaddressed. When Attila has left, Adrian admits to himself the rightness of the Sierra Leonean psychiatrist's views. He now also begins to develop a greater appreciation for local coping mechanisms, such as fatalism, silence, and animism, which tend to be summarily dismissed or looked down upon by Western aid workers, yet which Adrian eventually comes to see as viable and legitimate survival strategies. The novel shows how local coping methods may even trump popular Western ideas about trauma treatment, which, however, it does not dismiss out of hand. There is a lot more to be said about the memory of love, but In the interest of time, I would like to move on now to the management of grief, the short story by the Indo-American writer Bharati Mukherjee, which to this day I think is the best-known literary memorial to the Air India tragedy. It's included in her collection The Middleman and Other Stories from 1988. In fact, it is thanks to this story that I first became aware of this history, and I think many people who were not directly affected will probably recognize that experience. I was pleased to see that the management of grief will be discussed in at least 2 or 3 other papers at this conference, because I can't possibly do it justice in just a few minutes. Having already co-authored a non-fiction book about the legacy of the Air India bombing with her husband Clark Blaze, Mukherjee wrote this story out of sorrow as well as out of anger at the Canadian government's poor handling of the catastrophe and its aftermath. She shares these sentiments with the central character of her story, which explores the impact of the Air India disaster on the Indo-Canadian community, and specifically on the narrator protagonist, Shayla Bave, who lost her husband and her 2 sons in the crash. The management of grief highlights and condemns the cultural insensitivity displayed by the government, whose one-size-fits-all approach to recovery from trauma is shown to be inadequate, disrespectful, and offensive, considering the variety of ways in which the victims' relatives seek to come to terms with the loss of their loved ones and get on with their lives. Mainstream society's ignorant perception of Indo-Canadian citizens as not quite Canadians or second-class citizens is represented in the story through the clueless and clumsy treatment of the victims' families by the government social worker Judith Templeton. Shayla, who to her own surprise maintains an outward appearance of calm following the attack, is perceived by Judith as coping very well and as a pillar of strength who can serve as an intermediary between the social service agencies and the bereaved immigrant community, most of whose members, according to Judith, are hysterical. Judith readily admits that, and this is the first quotation on the slide, "I have no experience with a tragedy of this scale and with the complications of culture, language, and customs," and asks Shayla to help her find the human touch, or rather the right human touch, as she puts it, which Judith is aware we social service providers don't always have. Shayla is skeptical about being held up as an example, telling Judith in the next quotation, "By the standards of the people you call hysterical, I am behaving very oddly and very badly, Miss Templeton. They would not see me as a model. I do not see myself as a model. In fact," she tells the reader, "I am a freak. No one who has ever known me would think of me reacting this way. This terrible calm will not go away." She scorns the social worker's sterile, prescriptive methods of managing grief and is irked by her attitude of neo-colonial benevolence. Nothing I can do will make any difference," she says. "We must all grieve in our own way." Despite her misgivings, Shayla agrees to act as a cultural interpreter out of politeness. Eventually, however, she can no longer tolerate Judith's complaints about stubborn and ignorant Indo-Canadians who refuse to mourn according to the rules laid down in her textbooks. Shayla asks to be let out of Judith's car and, in abandoning her, definitively rejects the rigid system of grief management she would impose on Shayla and the other victims' relatives. The system pushed by Judith involves a set series of stages to pass through: rejection, depression, acceptance, reconstruction. Judith is impatient with many of the victims' families because of what she perceives as their failure to move on from depressed acceptance to reconstruction 6 months after the attack. Shayla, however, rejects acceptance, which means speaking of your family in the past tense, as she has a powerful sense that her family is still present, which she is unwilling to let go of. As she tells the reader, this is the second quotation on this slide, "My boys and my husband are with me too, more than ever. I will not pretend that I accept." Her family still surrounds her, even though, as she explains in the final quotation, like creatures in epics, they've changed shapes. She clings to and draws new strength from the voices and the shapes and the nights filled with visions. The first vision that she had of her husband occurred to her on a visit to a temple in India, in a scene full of Hindu imagery, emphasizing Shayla's cultural roots. Through her experience and that of several other Indo-Canadian characters whose stories are recounted, the management of grief introduces and validates alternative epistemologies and paradigms for trauma recovery involving reference to a spirit world and reincarnation. Like the other two texts I have considered, Mukherjee's story can be seen to expose and disrupt the imperial logic behind much of the globalization of trauma theory. In their respective works, Rankin, Fauna, and Mukherjee foster attunement to the psychic suffering of othered individuals and groups which a dominant trauma paradigm ignores, marginalizes, or misconstrues. They do so, moreover, without resorting to the kinds of avant-garde experimentation or modernist pyrotechnics beloved of many canonical trauma writers and perhaps especially trauma theorists. Rankin's poetic language is unadorned, plain, direct, conversational prose, and the memory of love and the management of grief are both fine examples of literary realism. All three texts make good candidates, it seems to me, for inclusion in an expanded trauma canon. For that to happen, though, the field of trauma theory will have to take up the challenge these texts pose, in my reading of them, to remove its Eurocentric blinkers and to embark on the path of pluralization and diversification. Thank you.